To Ukraine now, where the country's president is holding high-stakes talks with NATO today. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg delivered remarks earlier. Zelensky says that his troops will start pulling back weapons from war-torn eastern Ukraine. His forces are fighting Russia-backed rebels in the region. NATO also reaffirmed its commitment to its partnership.
This comes as Zelensky becomes engulfed in the impeachment drama underway back in Washington. An article in the New Yorker called "Ukraine's Unlikely President Promising a New Style of Politics Gets a Taste of Trump's Swamp." And that article takes a deep dive into the Ukrainian president and how the newly elected leader is navigating the situation. New Yorker correspondent Joshua Yaffa wrote that article, and he's joining us now from Moscow. Thank you so much for being with us, Joshua. You can start out by telling our audience who may not be aware of who Volodymyr Zelensky was before he had this meteoric rise in Ukrainian politics.
Sure. The most salient part of his biography is exactly, as you suggested, what he did before politics, which is to say what he did before last year, really. He was the highest profile and most famous member of a troupe of comedians and satirists who spent the last decade poking fun at the culture of political excess and corruption inside Ukrainian political life, a kind of Ukrainian Saturday Night Live, if you will, with Zelensky as the main star. And his most famous role was playing a high school teacher turned unlikely president named Vasyl Holoborodko in a show called Servant of the People that ran for 3 seasons. It was a fish out of water comedy in which Zelensky, playing Holoborodko, ended up in all sorts of madcap situations, showing how absurd and funny it was to think of a normal, honest guy in Ukraine's political culture. And it was that role and the image of Zelensky as an uncorruptible, fresh face that vaunted him to the presidency in the spring of this year.
And I think what's so interesting that you sort of lay out about him is there, in fact, are some similarities that he has with President Trump, right? Of course, there's the TV stardom thing, but even his character as president, because he's, you know, not a political guy, he sort of says things like it is, and people really appreciate that type of talk, that non-political speak, which I think, you know, the president also, people like the way President Trump speaks as a result of that. Sometimes they don't. Except, I think one of the key differences that you seem to point out is that Zelensky's rise into the actual presidency was sort of uplifting. Like, this is all that we can be here in Ukraine, versus we remember the president when he was being sworn in and that kind of doom and gloom, and this is how bad it could be. American Carnage speech, right? I thought that was sort of the key difference. And so now Zelensky finds himself in a situation where, you know, he can't sort of be sloppy with his talk. In fact, it almost appears as if that both Zelensky and his aides are trying desperately to sort of make promises without actually making promises. You know, suddenly they're speaking like politicians, saying things that they don't actually, you know, agree with and being non-committal. So how has he been responding to all of this fallout?
Well, as you pointed out, their education has been swift and dramatic in the ways of politics. I think much more intense than they bargained for. And you're right to say that Zelensky's rhetoric, what made him popular as a candidate and makes him popular as a young president, is that he retains his outsider status. He really plays that up, and he plays up how he's not like the successive generations of politicians and presidents who have ruled Ukraine before him. It is tricky, as you rightly point out, now that he's ended up in the middle of this geopolitical drama and impeachment scandal in Washington. And it's clear that both Zelensky himself, his aides, those who came to power around him, would like to stay as far away from this unfolding political scandal in Washington as possible. The most important thing for Ukraine that it's been able to maintain really for the past 30 or so years since its independence after the fall of the Soviet Union was bipartisan support in Washington. There was really a consensus among both Republicans and Democrats that supporting independent Ukraine was in America's interests. Ukraine has been supported by high-profile politicians from both parties over the years until very recently. the idea of supporting Ukraine militarily in its standoff with Russia and the war in the Donbass region that you mentioned was uncontroversial. Politicians from both parties thought it was important to provide Ukraine with that military assistance, and that's certainly policy priority number one for Zelensky. So what he's trying to do, and we'll see if he can pull it off, is to somehow emerge from this scandal unscathed without having seemed to have taken sides. He can't really afford to do anything that would anger Trump, and who's the sitting U.S. president and may be for some time. And he also can't do anything that would risk aggravating or disappointing the Democrats, who already have the majority in the House of Representatives and may well take the presidency next year. So that's his policy priority number one. And anything, the outcome of the impeachment fight in Washington is a second order issue, or really a non-issue for him as compared to keeping that bipartisan support.
Joshua, I think for our viewers and folks here back home, it does perhaps seem remarkable that this all started not only because the Ukrainians need that military aid that the Congress had earmarked, and that, as you pointed out, had been a nonpartisan issue for decades, military aid to Ukraine, but also that Zelensky just wanted to come to the Oval Office. He just wanted to come to Washington, D.C. And meet the president, because that would send a very strong signal to Moscow that the United States was an engaged and willing partner in preserving Ukraine's independence. Now, you asked him about that frozen military aid, and he said this: large empires have always used smaller countries for their own interests. But in this political chess match, I will not let Ukraine be a pawn. I think that's a fascinating quote, also because the president at one point seemed to conflate Zelensky's nationality, saying that he was Russian. He's not Russian. He's Ukrainian. And I think that goes a long way into explaining, what he expressed to you.
That's right. He was wary of getting involved. I think he understood the dangers if he were to give Trump and Giuliani and others in that camp too much of what they wanted, announcing an investigation into the Bidens or whatever those various requests were, the favor, quote unquote, that came up in that July 25th call between Trump and Zelensky. He knew that by going all in on that would really politicize Ukraine in Washington in a way that it hadn't been before, as we discussed. But he also realized giving too strong or forceful and certainly public no or rebuttal to President Trump could also have unintended consequences and undesirable consequences on Ukraine, who, as we've talked about, really depends on that military aid and its fight with Russian-backed separatists in the east of the country, and on this question of the Oval Office meeting. I'm glad you mentioned that. That wasn't a priority just because Zelensky wanted the photo op, wanted to take a selfie in the Oval Office with Trump. There was a lot of strategic implication and symbolism in that meeting, as Zelensky and his advisors understood it. You mentioned an unnamed advisor of Zelensky's in my article for The New Yorker talked about it being a symbol to Russia. Trump is someone who has been seen to be friendly or conciliatory to the positions of Vladimir Putin, Zelensky's main antagonist in the Donbass war. So if Zelensky could get a meeting in the Oval Office, get that handshake, it would really be a signal to Moscow that the United States had Ukraine's back. And it would also be a signal back home in Ukraine. Zelensky was a green politician, an untested politician, as we've talked about, someone who came from the world of television entertainment. And as far as the Ukrainian domestic political scene is concerned, nothing gives you that stamp of authenticity, that imprimatur of a politician who's really arrived and can carry himself with real weight and influence, like a meeting with the U.S. president. As seen in Ukraine and around the world, still perhaps the most powerful country in the world. So that's a real powerful signal to be used both in relations with Russia and with his own stature at home in Ukraine.
Joshua, you also point out in your article that Zelensky's rise, one of the things that he did is that he didn't talk to the media very much and preferred to talk directly to the public, much like President Trump in a way. I'm wondering what the media's take on this whole thing is in Ukraine. Here, it's a huge story, but is it a huge story in Ukraine, or for them, is it just about, are we getting the money, or we got the money, and so let's put that to bed and move on to something else?
It's certainly not nearly the size or intensity of a story as it is in the U.S., though I suppose that's to be imagined, that nowhere else would the story be given the same kind of attention or focus that it is here at home. That said, you're right in that the prism through which a lot of Ukrainian media outlets, journalists, and the public view this whole story, the scandal that erupted in September with the whistleblower complaint, now moving on to impeachment hearings, really is about what does this mean for us? How do we not become the accidental victim of these processes we don't really understand and certainly don't want to get involved in? There is some bitterness and resignation, disappointment among Ukrainian civil society activists, anti-corruption activists, people who really looked up to America and to American calls over the years for Ukraine to be a rule of law state, for Ukrainian politicians to not exert political pressure over law enforcement and judicial bodies. For those activists, they always look to U.S. pressure as kind of a helpful tool, a way of forcing or encouraging Ukrainian politicians to clean up their act, as it were, to not be engaged in corruption, to not exert political control over the courts and law enforcement. So the fact that there seems to have been those requests coming from Washington, I think that's a dispiriting turn of events for many people in the civil society and anti-corruption worlds in Ukraine. They were used to quite the opposite kind of messaging coming from Washington over the years.
Oh, that's interesting. Joshua Yaffa, thank you so much. Great article.
Thank you.